Shalom. This is Michael Root at Ophel Gardens on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. King David selected this very mountaintop as the location where the temple was to be built. He saw this mountain by revelation and knew that this was the place where all of the feasts of the Lord were to be rehearsed. David set aside a treasure to finance the temple that his son Solomon would build. 500 years after its completion, the temple was destroyed, and the royal family was exiled into Babylon, where the males were made eunuchs and trained to serve in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. One of these young men was Daniel. Daniel received detailed revelations concerning the coming of the Messiah. Some of that revelation we have on our hands today. Some Daniel was not allowed to divulge. Daniel was given specific revelations concerning the end of man's dominion upon the earth, but his attempts to calculate their fulfillment ended in disappointment. Sir Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists and mathematicians in history, spent many years of his life attempting to decode those same revelations. And, like Daniel, Newton went to his grave without understanding the divine equations. Isaac Newton was a genius, but even though he read Hebrew, he filtered the scriptures through a Western, Gentile mindset. He had no idea that the key to understanding Daniel's prophecies was understanding the feast of the Lord and their prophetic fulfillment. This information was shut up until the last days. Isaac Newton, like Daniel, didn't need to know, but we do.
Now, in the book of Daniel, it speaks of, in the 8th chapter, the 2,300 evenings and mornings of Daniel 8. The 1,290 days of Daniel 12. The 1,260 days of Daniel 7, Daniel 12, and Revelation 12. The 1,335 days of Daniel 12. What all seem to be indecipherable mathematical calculations to the Western Gentile mind are in fact precise fulfillments of each one of the feasts of the Lord. And they are fulfillments that will go down to the very day, the very hour, the exact moment, in every detail, including the feast of Hanukkah, which has a shadow of Antiochus Epiphanes as the Antichrist, and Purim, which is a picture of Haman as the Antichrist. Now we know that Daniel had all of the information that we now have in his book, and with all the calculations that he had, all the numbers that he had, that what he set about to do was to decipher these things and to determine what the fulfillment of these things would be. And as the book of Daniel indicates, that Daniel was working on these things day and night. Now, and he is a responsible man. He is the president of Babylon underneath Darius the Mede at this particular time. Now, Daniel, who's been given all this revelation, is working day and night. For 2 weeks, he is poring over all these calculations. And then finally, he's making himself sick. He's becoming physically ill because he can't work it out. Now, he's in charge of all the Chaldean astronomers for 60 years. He is the wisest man in the entire empire, and he's one of the wealthiest in the entire empire. He's been given direct revelation by the angel Gabriel in so many instances, and now he is working himself into a frenzy and getting ill because he can't figure these things out. And so then God sends the angel Gabriel down to him, and the angel said, "Daniel, get a life. You are not going to understand these things. They are sealed up until the time of the end. You are going to be dead and in the grave before these things transpire. Now just let it go." And he finally let it go. Why could Daniel not know these things? Because the Feast of Purim and the Feast of Hanukkah had not even been put in place at that time. And the Messiah had not interpreted these things and given the prophetic significance to them until we come to the Gospels. We see that he speaks in Matthew 24 concerning the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel. It is at that time, it is at the time of Purim, that he is speaking these things, exposing the Antichrist, the one who is the desolator, who causes the abomination that makes desolate, and he's speaking about that at the time of Purim. We see that he goes up to the feast of Hanukkah, and he says that I am the light of the world. And he is the one that is going to overcome the beast, the false prophet, Satan, Antichrist. He is the one that is going to light the world again, and it is the 8th day, the new beginning, in which we see these things take place. And 8 days is the duration of each one of the feasts. Even the spring feast, the feast of unleavened bread, is 7 days in duration, but during that feast, on the Bikurim, we begin counting to the 50th day, and that takes us to the final fulfillment of the spring feast. That makes it an 8-day feast in its final duration. Also, the Feast of Sukkot is a 7-day feast, and then there is another day added on to the end. It's called the last great day, and that's a high Sabbath as well. 8 is the number of new beginnings. And then Hanukkah is a feast of 8-day duration, and the 8th day, again, is the new beginning. So Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights, when the Messiah went up to it, he said, I am the light of the world. I am the Shamash. That Shamash, which is the light that lights every other one of those lights, that is the Messiah. He lights every light that comes into the world. And we see that 8 days, we light those eight candles in the window, using the Shamash, that 9th candle, and it is looking back at that miracle that has happened, but we also recognize that the Messiah is the light of the world. And so each year, Hanukkah is just a treasured time for that 8 days, because the light grows brighter each day. And on the last day, that is the day that the angel Gabriel came to Miriam and announced that she would bear the light of the world, the Messiah. And that is the day that she conceived, and exactly 280 days later to the very day, and we've worked it out according to the astronomical detail of the sighting of the new moon down to hundreds of % of illumination, and we know that exactly 280 days that year is Tishri 15, the Feast of Tabernacles, when the Word is made flesh and tabernacled among us. The light that lights every man that comes into the world. He literally is the fulfillment of this feast in the positive. Kislev 25, it's the Feast of Hanukkah, and that initiates the altar dedication. It is an 8-day dedication, and that is when the oblation offering begins. Now, what is the oblation that Daniel speaks of? Remember, he speaks of the 2,300 days in Daniel chapter 8. The word days in your margin says evenings and mornings, because in the Hebrew it is 2,300 evenings and mornings. It's dealing with the oblation sacrifice. What is the oblation? It is at the morning hour of prayer. There is a perfect male lamb of the first year that is taken, and it is sacrificed. The blood is poured out in a cotton bowl, and they take the entire lamb and they incinerate it on the altar at the time of the morning prayers. It is an offering to God, complete incineration of that animal, and it is a recognition that God is the owner of the heavens and the earth, because he has created it. The evening oblation is the same thing in the evening hour of prayer, but it is a recognition that God is the owner of the heavens and the earth, because he has redeemed it. What is done with that blood? It is poured out into the earth. It may not be put on that altar, because it's not an atonement for sin. This is strictly God saying that this is a sweet odor to his nostrils. He owns it all, and if he wants a lamb sacrificed and incinerated in the morning and evening, he gets it, whether the people for the ethical treatment of animals likes it or not. He owns the heavens and the earth. And it says that it is a sweet odor in the nostrils of God. There's nothing wrong with that oblation sacrifice. Has nothing to do with blood atonement. And no more blood is going to be put on the Ark of the Covenant. Make no more mistake about that. Because Israel, when they know their Messiah, they will see that ark as they do now, a very holy thing. 2,300 evenings and morning. How long does it take to do 2,300 evening and morning oblations? It takes exactly 1,150 days. So after that 8-day dedication of the altar, on Tevet 3 is when the oblation sacrifice begins. We go exactly 1,150 days, and what day do we come to? Adar 15, when the Feast of Purim, when the latter day Haman stops the oblation and the sacrifice. That's when he stops the oblation and sacrifice. And remember, Haman, who wants to kill the bride of the king and all those who keep the commandments of God, Revelation chapter 12, that is when he goes after the bride of the king and all those who keep the commandments. And as it says in Daniel chapter 12 about the 1290 days, you go exactly 1290 days from that very day, and we come to Tishri 15, which is the Feast of Sukkot. It is the marriage supper of the Lamb, when the bride who has overcome now marries the king. And all those who keep the commandments of God are the guest at the marriage supper of the Lamb. All of the shadow pictures were all there, and they all work out to the very day of their fulfillment. Now, it speaks of Daniel chapter 12. Blessed are they that come to the 1,335 days. You go from the abomination of desolation, the day that we must leave Jerusalem, when the anti-Messiah makes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, sitting on the Ark of the Covenant, the throne of God, declaring that he is God, setting up his kingdom upon the earth, for which the next 3.5 years is nothing but turmoil and bloodshed. And we go from that very day, we go 1,335 days, and we come to Kislev 25, the dedication of the Messiah's new millennial temple. Right to the day. To the day. And then we see Nisan 15, Elijah and Moses arrive at Passover. Why do we say Elijah and Moses? Because at every Jewish wedding, there are always two witnesses. They represent Elijah, the prophets, and Moses, the Torah. At every official state function in the land of Israel, the two witnesses, Elijah and Moses. At the transfiguration of the Lord, anointing him for his ministry as the high priest at the Day of Atonement. Who were there? Elijah and Moses. Who is the person that we set at the Passover table each year, a place for someone to come at Passover? Who is that prophet? Elijah. And just before the meal starts, we go to the door, open it to see if Elijah comes, because we know Elijah must come before the Messiah. And do we really expect him to come walking down our street? No, it's a rehearsal. We know it's a rehearsal. In fact, John the Baptist, the prophet who came in the spirit and power of Elijah, was born on that very day. Aviv, or Nisan 15. That is the day that the latter day Elijah and Moses come, and they won't be babies. They will be fire-breathing prophets who will be able to toast any of their enemies that stand up against them like bad marshmallows at a campfire. They are going to shut up the heavens for 3.5 years, and it says that they testify in Jerusalem, where now, Revelation chapter 11, how long do they testify in the city of Jerusalem? 42 months, which is 1,260 days or 3.5 years. And it says that when their testimony is finished, that they are killed. You know, I believe that's when all of us are going to die. Every one of us. When our testimony is finished. So I would encourage you to get a testimony and drag it out as long as you possibly can. And when it's done, okay, you've done it. That's it. It's over with. When these men have finished their testimony, 3.5 years, they're going to be killed, they're going to be laying dead in the street of Jerusalem, and they're going to lay there for 3.5 days in the hot sun. Rigor mortis has set in. They blowed up like a couple of armadillos on a Texas highway in the summertime. Everyone is giving gifts to each other. They're making fun of them. And then, after 3.5 days, an earthquake takes place to get everyone's attention, and those two men, those two witnesses, stand up on their feet. When they stand up on their feet, the people in unison say, "Oh, no." But yet, out of the portals of heaven, what is heard is the high priest in heaven then calling out to those two witnesses, "Come up hither! Come up here!" And those two witnesses then ascend up before the high priest and elders in heaven. They give their sighting, their visible reckoning of the sighting of the first sliver of the new moon. And when they give their sighting to the high priest and elders, and the high priest then cries out from the portals of heaven, "Sound the trumpet." And the trumpet sounds, and it is the last trumpet in the book of Revelation, and it says, "Now is come the time of the dead, when the righteous are raised and rewarded. His servants, the prophets, small and great, are gathered together. And now is come the time of his wrath, and he will destroy those destroyers of the earth." This is the time of the gathering together. This is the resurrection of the saints. This is the rapture of the church. This is when we are gathered together. Those two witnesses are there for a reason. It is the day of trumpets, Yom Teruah, the day that the high Sabbath, which occurs on a day and hour that no man knows, in which right from the very first time that the trumpets blew from Sinai, and we were required every year on the 7th month, on the first day of the month, to have a holy convocation, which we prepared in advance, and if we didn't get our garments clean and we weren't ready for it, we would have missed it. And this is a day that it was rehearsing every year up to this point. This is what we're looking forward to. Now, I know you wanted to be out of here 7 years earlier. But he did say that those days would be shortened. And how are they shortened? By 10 days. Because Tishri 10 ends the last Shavuot. But at the end of this thing, we're going to be real pleased that at least it was shortened by 10 days. You'll be thankful for 10 days about that particular time. So we see that the Feast of Trumpets begins when the two witnesses are called before the high priest in heaven, report the new moon.
Then we have the 23rd verse. It says, "And Yahweh spake unto Moshe, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, in the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, and holy convocation, a kadosh mikra, a holy rehearsal." And this right here, this one verse in the book of Leviticus opens up the most intense, the most glorious, the most talked about feast in all of the Torah. Yes, the memorial of the day of the blowing of trumpets is spoken of, and more chapters of the Bible are devoted to that incident than any other thing. And that's why nothing much needs to be said here, because we've got the entire book of Deuteronomy that is almost a non-stop recitation of what happened at Mount Sinai, what happened because of what happened at Mount Sinai. And so this is singularly, prophetically significant. And most of the world is completely ignorant of it. You'll even hear, Messianics say, well, this is about all we know about the Day of Trumpets. Well, that only shows gross ignorance, a gross ignorance of which would be so embarrassing if those words ever come out of my mouth. I mean, take a ball bat to me immediately. I mean, that is idiocy beyond belief, but not as great of idiocy as the whole Christian world, who has refused to even acknowledge that most propitious moment in history. Ladies and gentlemen, the day that we remember the blowing of trumpets is a day that Moses says that we are to especially remember that day.
Tishri 1 is a day of announcements. It's the day that the 10 Commandments were given. It was also the day when the first sliver of the new moon appeared of Tishri 1, in which the announcement of the birth of the righteous king, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, was made. It is also going to be the announcement for the confirmation of the covenant spoken by the prophet Daniel, and it is also a picture of the resurrection in the last day.
This is Yom Teruah, literally the Day of Trumpets. This is the day that we are to blow trumpets as a memorial of the day that the commandments were shouted down from Mount Sinai. It is unlike any other Hebrew feast because it starts when the first sliver of the new moon is seen, and not a moment before, which means you can prepare for it, but no man knows the day or the hour when it will begin. If this sounds like something you heard the Messiah say, you're right, because Yom Teruah is the prophetic marker of the Messiah's return.
Yom Teruah, or the Feast of Trumpets, is just the beginning of our fall feast.
That's right.
And we've had a lot of questions from partners that have come in about what is Yom Teruah, why do we keep Yom Teruah, how do we keep Yom Teruah?
Okay.
And so We wanted to spend this time with you today and really answer these questions for you, give you a little bit more insight into the fall feast and why we keep them.
Yeah, you know, it's not sometimes people say, well, why do I have to keep the feast? And it's not that, it's I get to keep the feast.
That's right, we get to live as Yeshua did.
That's right, and you know, the feasts are so important. People say, well, again, why don't you do Christmas? Why don't you do Easter? Because the feasts are so much more connected to Him. Let me explain a little bit of how this works, if I could.
Please.
Okay, so Yom Teruah, that's just the beginning of the fall feasts. Now, I always tell people that the fall feasts mark the Messiah's birth, death, resurrection, and second coming in order. In order. And that's what's so amazing about them. So here's how this goes. So about 2 weeks from now, you'll have Sukkot. This is the Feast of Tabernacles. And this is the day that Yeshua was born. We could get into it, but we won't. But we can prove that this is the day Yeshua was born. 8 days later, remember what happened 8 days after he was born? He was circumcised. That is another feast day. That is Hoshana Rabbah. That is the last day of the Feast of Sukkot. Now, you go through the calendar, we come up at around Easter, Passover time. Well, Passover is when he was, so first he's born, he's circumcised, now we go through his life, now he is crucified. After the crucifixion on Passover, now there's the Feast of First Fruits. The Feast of First Fruits is when he was raised from the dead. And then after that, we have Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks. Shavuot means weeks. And that's essentially when the Spirit was given. It's also the day that the commandments were shouted down from heaven. Interesting. So, and then you go into his second coming. Yom Teruah is the last trump. That's when Yeshua returns. Then what happens again? We get to Yom Kippur. Perhaps you've heard of that one before. Yom Kippur is the day of judgment, or judgment day.
It also lets us know what to expect. You know, there's a lot of things going on in this earth right now. The oceans, the seas, they're crying out. The earth is crying out with all the hurricanes that are happening, the fires on the west coast of the United States. We know countries that are flooding, like India, New Zealand, countries in Europe, and even here in the United States. There's so much happening right now.
In the book of Revelation, we have the Tzemach as the righteous judge, the king who rules as the righteous judge. And this is a sign that we are seeing tonight in heaven. The new moon is going to be in the belly of the woman, which indicates travail in the belly of the woman. This is 5 minutes after sunset that Venus and Mars and Mercury will all be in conjunction and with Regulus, the king star. And this is, again, where Jupiter, Hatzedek, is in conjunction and been in retrograde motion for 9 months, circling around the Tzemach. Behold, this is Jeremiah 23:5. This is the great sign in the heavens tonight. Behold, the days come, saith Yehovah, I will raise unto David a Hatzedek Tzemach, a righteous branch. Hatzedek Tzemach. And a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. In his days Judah will be rescued, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name whereby he will be called, Yehovah Tzidkenu, Yehovah our righteousness. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith Yehovah, that they shall no more say, Yehovah lives, which brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But they will say, Yehovah lives, which brought up and which led the seed of the house of Israel out of the north country and from all countries whither I had driven them, and they shall dwell in their own land.
But the scriptures were written for us to know the times.
That's right.
And Yom Teruah is very specific. It's the last, the last trump that happens in Revelation. So on the last trump is when the Yeshua returns, the Messiah comes back, and then it leads us into the 10 days of awe,
right?
Which are the 10 days between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. So that's the day that we are commanded to fast, to afflict our souls for the return, for the judgment, and then we have Sukkot. Now, people ask, there's a lot of people, new individuals, who ask, how do you celebrate the Feast of Trumpets? There's only a few things that are asked of us in the scriptures that are commanded of us. One is to blow the shofars, or shofar, and to remember the commandments, and that it's a high holy day.
Which means you don't work.
That's right, no work. Outside of that, the rest is really up to you.
God told Moses to instruct the people, I never, ever want you to ever forget this day, Israel. Never forget this day. So from now on the seventh month, on the first day of the seventh month, thou shalt have a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. You will remember this day as long as you live forever. And it is to be a statute for all your generations forever to remember this very day in which God spoke his commandments. When you are gathered together in the presence of God, and it is to be done on the seventh month, on the first day of the month. Even though it originally occurred at the time of Shavuot, in the Pentecost, at the time of the spring feast. But yet, why did God move it to the seventh month, the first day of the seventh month? Because none of the seventh month or Sabbath month feasts begin their final fulfillments until the seventh or Sabbath millennium, the day or the millennium of the Lord. And just as the rabbis taught, that as the sun was created on the fourth day, so the Messiah will come on the fourth day, and literally on Tishri 15 of 3999, with less than 18 months to go in the fourth millennium, the Word was made flesh and tabernacled among us. It has now been 2 days or 2,000 years since he came the first time as he tabernacled among us. Now it has been 2 days. We have entered into 6001, the seventh or the Sabbath millennium. After 2 days, Hosea says, he will revive us. In the third day, he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. We have now entered into the time of the third day. It will be Tishri 1. Do you know what the Gregorian date that will fall on? No, you don't. That day and hour knows no man. You never know when Tishri 1 is. It's a feast that occurs on a day and hour that no man knows, and that is the way it has been rehearsed all these years. So, as Hosea said, after 2 days he will revive us. In the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight.
The book of Revelation speaks of 144,000 followers of the Messiah who are sealed for divine protection. These are not 144,000 Jewish evangelists, as is popularly interpreted, but 12,000 from each of the tribes of Israel. The tribe of Judah comprises only 1/12 of this invincible body. This mountaintop is where I would like to be on the day that the latter rain is poured out on God's people. But I expect that access to the Temple Mount on that day will be by invitation only, and limited to exactly 144,000. The 10th chapter of the book of Revelation records a very disturbing incident. John is told to ignore an order from heaven that he was given at the very beginning of his revelation. An angel, whose feet stand on both land and sea, unrolled a scroll and began to read. John records that his voice sounded like the roar of a lion, and each of the 7 statements that he made were like thunder from heaven. John began to write down the words of the angel, but out of the heavens a voice shouted, "Stop! Do not write these words." Why was John told to stop? He was told at the very beginning to write down all of the things that you have seen, all of the things that are now, and all of the things which shall be in the future. He was told to write these things so that the servants of the Messiah would know about the things which must come to pass in the future. John was not allowed to write the 7 thunders because these are things that the Messiah does not want his servants to know in advance. The one thing that we do understand, however, is that when those 7 thunders are completed, the work of the saints on earth is done. The 7 thunders are the bloody gauntlet just before the finish line. When the 7 thunders are finished, the day of trumpets will be fulfilled. When the last trumpet sounds and the righteous dead are raised with an incorruptible body, and those believers who are still alive will put on immortality. The Messiah pronounced a blessing on all those who would read the book of Revelation, because in the last days he would reveal that the book of Revelation is the detail of how he will fulfill the fall feast of the Lord. Papias, a noted first century believer, recorded that Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew language, and several have done their best to translate it into other languages. It was initially translated into Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Matthew's writing contains so many Hebrew figures of speech that its Hebrew origin is obvious to Semitic language experts. The book of Revelation is likewise full of Hebrew figures of speech, and with allusions to the fall feast of the Lord. But those who are ignorant of the feast read right past incredible treasures, not even lifting a questioning eyebrow. Without an understanding of the fall feast of the Lord, the book of Revelation is genuinely beyond comprehension.